Have you ever had to wear a mask for your own family just to see what their true faces looked like? I have. My mask was grief, a heavy velvet thing that was easy enough to slip on because it was already half true. Theirs was concern. And concern, I've learned, can be the most dangerous mask of all. It's a lonely feeling, playing a part in your own home. If you've ever felt that, if you've ever had to search for the truth in the faces of the people you're supposed to trust the most, then maybe you'll understand my story. People tell me stories like this, about finding your strength when no one thinks you have any left, need to be shared. So, if you agree, a simple like or a subscribe would mean a great deal. It would let me know I'm not just talking into the void. My story started 3 months after my husband, Robert, passed away. The Vermont winter had settled deep into the bones of our old house. A quiet that was once comforting now felt heavy, empty. I was sitting at the oak table in the living room, the one he'd bought at an antique market in Brattleboro. The air still smelled faintly of him, old books and pipe tobacco. In front of me was one of his old chess puzzles from a leather-bound journal. White to move, mate in 3. He'd loved these little intellectual games, and solving them felt like having a conversation with him, a way to keep his mind alive in the crushing silence of the house. I moved the ivory knight, my fingers tracing the worn-smooth wood. I saw the sequence, the subtle trap for the Black King. It was clever. It was so Robert. That's when the phone rang, its shrill cry cutting through the quiet. I looked at the caller ID. David. My son. We hadn't spoken in weeks, not since the perfunctory call after the funeral where he'd spent more time asking about the insurance paperwork than about how I was holding up. I let it ring one more time before answering, just to compose myself. Hello, David. Hi, Mom, how are you feeling? His voice was syrupy, a thick, practiced warmth that didn't sound like him at all. David's natural state was a kind of hurried impatience. This new tone was like a cheap suit worn to an important meeting. It just didn't fit. I'm managing, dear, I said, my voice a little thin. That part wasn't an act. I know. I've just been so worried about you, all alone in that big house. He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. I could almost hear him mentally ticking a box on a checklist. Listen, I've been thinking. I know you're proud, Mom, but you need some help. So I've found someone. I gripped the phone a little tighter. The white knight on the chessboard seemed to mock me. Someone? What kind of someone? A caretaker, Mom. A companion. Her name is Chloe. She's wonderful, so kind, and she's a great cook. She can help with the little things, just be there so you're not alone. She can start next week. He said it all in a rush, a flood of pre-planned words designed to wash over any objection. He hadn't asked. He had informed. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. This wasn't about my well-being. This was a move, a piece being placed on the board. My son, who couldn't be bothered to drive 2 hours to see his grieving mother, had somehow found the time to hire a live-in stranger for me. It was then, in that moment, that I made a choice. The librarian in me, the one who'd spent 40 years reading between the lines, saw the beginning of a new, unsettling story. And the wife of a brilliant historian knew that the first step to winning a war is to understand your opponent's strategy. So I let out a small, shaky sigh. I let my voice crack just a little. Oh, David, I don't know, I suppose you're right. It is so lonely here without your father. The relief in his voice was sickeningly palpable. It's the right thing to do, Mom. You'll love her. Her name is Chloe. She'll be there on Monday. We hung up a few moments later. I sat there, the silence of the room pressing in on me again, but it was different now. It was charged. A stranger was coming into my home. A stranger hired by my son for reasons I was sure had nothing to do with my comfort. I looked down at the chessboard. White to move. Yes, it was. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that I would have to play the part of a confused, helpless old queen just to find out what game my own son was playing. Chloe arrived on a Monday, just as David had promised. The snow was falling in thick, silent flakes, coating the pine trees in a blanket of white. She stood on the porch, a burst of manufactured sunshine against the gray backdrop. She wore a bright pink coat, her smile wide and flawless, her eyes scanning the front of the house a little too keenly. She looked less like a caretaker and more like a real estate agent about to appraise a property. I opened the door, leaning on my walker a bit more than I needed to. Mrs. Vance, I'm Chloe. It is so wonder. Full to finally meet you, she chirped, her voice perfectly modulated. She stepped inside, bringing a gust of cold air and a cloyingly sweet floral perfume with her. Have you ever watched someone perform a role so perfectly that the perfection itself is the flaw? That was Chloe. Over the next few days, she was a whirlwind of helpfulness. She'd make me tea, fluff my pillows, and chat endlessly about her volunteer work at the local animal shelter. But I noticed things. Little things. My reading glasses, which for 40 years have lived on my nightstand, were suddenly discovered in the kitchen. "Oh, Maggie, you silly goose, look what you did," she'd say with a tinkling laugh, handing them to me. I would just smile faintly and thank her, my mind cataloging the discrepancy. The thermostat was another battleground. I liked the house at a steady 70 degrees. I'd wake up shivering, find it set to 64, and Chloe would say, "This old house. The drafts are just terrible, aren't they? Don't you worry, I'll get you another blanket." She never admitted to changing it. She just presented a solution to a problem she had created. It was a subtle, insidious kind of crazy making. The pinnacle of her performance came on Thursday morning. She came into the living room, a bright yellow planner in her hand. "Now, Maggie," she said, her tone gentle and patronizing, "don't forget we have your appointment with Dr. Miller at 2 o'clock today. We should probably leave around 1:30. I looked at her, my mind perfectly clear. My doctor's name is Peterson. I haven't seen a Dr. Miller in my life. I felt a flash of anger, so hot and sharp it almost made me gasp. But I pushed it down, replacing it with a mask of confused vulnerability. I furrowed my brow. "Dr. Miller? Oh dear, I don't seem to recall." Chloe's smile was full of pity. She reached out and patted my hand. "It's okay. That's what I'm here for, to help you remember." She held my hand for a second too long, her grip just a little too firm. It was in that moment, watching her feign sympathy while she tried to methodically dismantle my reality, that a memory surfaced, unbidden and unwelcome. It was from about 5 years ago, before Robert got sick. David had come to us, his face a mask of earnest desperation, asking for $20,000. It was for a can't-miss investment, he'd said, a tech startup with some friends that was guaranteed to triple in a year. Robert, my practical, brilliant Robert, had been skeptical. He'd asked for a business plan, for names, for specifics. But I saw my son, my only child, asking for help, and my heart overruled my head. I convinced Robert. 2 months later, I found a letter from a casino in Atlantic City, a final notice about a marker David had signed. There was no startup. There was no investment. There were only debts and lies layered on top of lies to cover them. When I confronted him, he didn't even look ashamed. He just looked annoyed that he'd been caught. The memory vanished as quickly as it came, leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. I looked at Chloe, who was now humming to herself as she organized my mail on the hall table, her movements efficient and purposeful. And I understood. It all clicked into place with the cold, hard certainty of a deadbolt sliding home. This wasn't about my memory. This wasn't about my safety. This was about my money. David had tried to get it through persuasion and lies before. Now he was trying to get it through manufactured incompetence. Chloe wasn't just a caretaker. She was a tool, an actor hired to write a fiction that would give my son control of everything Robert and I had built. The game was the same, only the strategy had changed. And she was the opening move. Knowing you're in a chess match is one thing, deciding on your opening move is another entirely. For 2 days after my realization, I did nothing. I simply observed. I watched Chloe perform her role, and I let her document my lapses. I let her find my car keys in the sugar bowl, a place I had deliberately put them. I allowed myself to forget her name twice, calling her Clara. Each time I saw a flicker of triumph in her eyes, a satisfaction she tried to hide behind a mask of concerned patience. She was building her case against me, one tiny, fabricated brick at a time. And I decided it was time to give her a cornerstone, one of my own choosing. On Saturday morning, I went to the bookshelf where Robert's journals were kept. There were dozens of them, a lifetime of thoughts bound in dark green leather. I selected the one from 2 years ago. It was a particularly painful year, the year Robert had his first health scare, the year we finally understood that our time was no longer a vast, open horizon. It was also the year David had last asked for a significant amount of money. I ran my fingers over the worn cover, the gold-leafed year glinting in the morning light. Then, I carried it into the living room and set it on the coffee table, leaving it slightly ajar. It was a calculated risk, a piece of my heart left out as bait. I spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet vigilance. I sat in my armchair, pretending to read a novel, but my attention was fixed on that journal. It was like a magnetic object in the center of the room. I watched Chloe circle it, her eyes darting towards it when she thought I wasn't looking. She'd straighten the magazines beside it, adjust the coaster next to it, her fingers almost itching to pick it up. She was trying to maintain her performance, but I could see the curiosity, the professional need to find something useful, warring with her caution. Late in the afternoon, I stood up slowly. "You know, Chloe," I said, my voice soft, "I think I'd like to try baking those lemon cookies Robert loved so much. Would you be a dear and fetch the big ceramic bowl from the top shelf of the pantry for me? My old shoulders can't quite make the reach anymore." Her smile was immediate and bright. "Of course, Maggie, anything for you." I knew it would take her a few minutes. I had put that bowl there myself for this very reason. I waited until I heard the sound of the pantry door closing, and then I walked, not to the kitchen, but silently back to the threshold of the living room, standing just out of sight in the dim hallway. And there she was. The mask was gone. She was perched on the edge of the sofa, her back to me, the journal open in her lap, her head bowed in concentration, devouring the pages. She wasn't tidying. She was searching. I took a quiet breath and stepped into the room. "Find anything interesting, dear." She jumped, a guilty, violent spasm, and the journal slid from her lap onto the floor, landing with a soft thud on the rug. Her head whipped around, her face pale, her eyes wide with the frantic look of a cornered animal. For a split second, I saw the real person, not Chloe the caretaker, but a terrified young woman caught in a lie. "Oh, Maggie," she stammered, scrambling to pick up the journal, her hands trembling. "You startled me. I was just straightening up. This was here and I didn't want it to get stained or anything." Her voice was a whole octave higher than usual. I walked over and gently took the book from her hands. My eyes didn't go to her face, but to the slim, red ribbon bookmark I had tucked inside the closed journal that morning. It was no longer at the front. It was now marking a page near the end. "Thank you for being so careful," I said, my voice unnervingly calm. I opened the book to the marked page as if to check for damage. I already knew what it said. It was Robert's entry from October 17th. His handwriting, usually so elegant, was sharp and angry. "Spoke with David again today," it read. "Another ridiculous scheme. Refused him outright. He has his mother's heart, but he has a hole in his soul where his integrity should be. I will be meeting with the lawyers next week to finalize the trust. Maggie will be protected. I will not see our life's work squandered." I closed the journal slowly. The first crack in her facade wasn't a crack. It was a chasm. She wasn't just looking for lapses in memory, she was looking for financial information. She was a spy. I looked at her, and for the first time I felt a sliver of fear, not for my money, but for my safety. This was more organized, more predatory than I had imagined, and I knew with absolute certainty I could not fight this alone. I needed an ally. For the rest of the evening after the journal incident, Chloe was a model of perfect behavior. She was quiet, attentive, and her sweetness was so thick it was almost suffocating. She treated me as if I were a delicate porcelain doll that might shatter at any moment. It was, I suspect, her way of overcorrecting, of trying to erase the moment the mask had slipped. But all it did was confirm the truth. I felt like a prisoner being watched by a very polite guard. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the old house groan under the weight of the new-fallen snow, I knew I had reached my limit. I couldn't just play defense anymore. I needed to gather my own evidence, and for that, I needed a leaner. Alina Perkins had been the head of reference at my library for 30 years. She was a woman who believed in facts, in primary sources, and in the Dewey Decimal System as a map to universal order. More importantly, she was the only person I knew over 70 who not only owned a smartphone, but actually knew how to use it. The next morning, I waited until Chloe was taking a long, loud shower, and I called her. "Alina, it's Maggie," I whispered, my hand cupped around the receiver. Maggie, I was just thinking about you. How are you holding up? Her voice was like a splash of cold, clean water, brisk, no nonsense, and utterly genuine. I have a bit of a book club problem, I said, choosing my words carefully. A rather complicated new story with an unreliable narrator. I was hoping you might come over and help me make sense of it. There was a pause. Eleanor was sharp. She knew I hated my book club selections. An unreliable narrator, you say, she said, her tone shifting slightly. I'll be there after lunch. You put the kettle on. She arrived at 1 o'clock, carrying a box of the shortbread cookies I liked. Chloe met her at the door with her dazzling smile. Oh, how lovely. Maggie, you didn't tell me you were having company, she gushed. Eleanor and I are discussing a new book for our club, I said calmly, taking my friend by the arm. We'll be in the sunroom. We don't want to be disturbed. As soon as the glass doors were closed, Eleanor's friendly expression dissolved. All right, Margaret, out with it. What's going on? And so I told her everything. The phone call from David, the gaslighting, the journal, the look on Chloe's face when I caught her. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her fingers steepled under her chin. She wasn't shocked. She was angry. A quiet, focused anger that was far more terrifying than any shouting. The little viper, she said when I finished, her voice a low growl. And David, I never trusted him, not since he lost that donation check for the library's fundraiser. She looked at me, her eyes clear and determined. Okay, an unreliable narrator requires objective observation. We need a camera. I must have looked taken aback because she gave a wry smile. Oh, please, Maggie. I've been watching my grandchildren on a baby monitor app for 5 years. This is the same principle, just with higher stakes. The plan came together quickly, born of her practicality and my knowledge of the house. The cover story was perfect. A new hobby, bird watching. The next day, Eleanor returned, carrying a large box for a fancy, outdoor birdcam 3000. She made a grand show of it for Chloe's benefit, talking loudly about wanting to see the blue jays at my feeder. We spent an hour outside in the freezing cold, theatrically setting up the large, obvious camera in the garden. Chloe even came out to offer us hot chocolate, watching us with bemused curiosity. But the real prize was in Eleanor's handbag. Once the decoy was in place, I asked Chloe to run to the store for some more of that special tea she liked. The moment her car pulled out of the driveway, Eleanor went to work. The device was ingenious. It was a tiny lens, no bigger than a pen tip, hidden in the spine of a book. The title, much to my grim satisfaction, was Edgar Allan Poe's Tales of Mystery and Imagination. Eleanor slid one of my own books out from the living room shelf and slipped the fake one into its place. It was invisible. She then quickly and quietly connected it to the Wi-Fi and installed an app on the small tablet I kept by my bed. There, she said, her work finished. Live feed, audio and video. It records to the cloud, so even if they find the camera, the evidence is safe. She squeezed my hand. You're not the narrator anymore, Maggie. Now you're the author. That night, after Chloe had wished me a good night with her usual saccharine smile, I closed my bedroom door and locked it. I sat in my armchair, my heart thudding, and picked up the tablet. I tapped the icon, a simple, discrete black square. The screen flickered for a second, and then my own living room appeared. It was empty. The light from the hallway spilled across the floral rug. I could see the armchair Chloe always sat in, the fireplace, and the table with Robert's half-finished chess game. The quality was perfectly clear. I could even hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't the one being watched. I was the watcher, and the board at last was beginning to turn. Having a secret eye in my own living room was a strange and terrible comfort. For 2 days, I watched the feed on my tablet whenever I was alone. I saw Chloe moving through my home, dusting my husband's photograph with a detached efficiency, making herself tea in my favorite mug. The footage was mundane, yet every second of it felt like a violation. I saw nothing explicitly incriminating, but the camera confirmed what I already knew in my bones. She was an actor on a stage, and her performance was constant. She was never just relaxing. She was always aware of her role, even when she was alone. The problem was, I needed more than a feeling. I needed a script. I needed to hear the words. So on the third day, I set a trap designed not for action, but for sound. I knew that Chloe usually made a private phone call in the late afternoon, right around 3 o'clock, after she'd brought me my tea and believed I was settling in for a nap. It was the perfect time. After she placed the teacup on the table beside the living room sofa, I gave her a weak, grateful smile. "Thank you, dear. I think I'll just rest my eyes for a bit," I said, letting a little tremor into my voice. I settled back into the cushions, pulling Robert's old Afghan up to my chin. I closed my eyes and I began to act. I focused on my breathing, slowing it down, making it the deep, even rhythm of genuine sleep. It's a difficult thing to fake sleep. You have to consciously relax every muscle to stop your eyelids from fluttering, to ignore the itch on your nose. You have to become a statue, a vessel of stillness, while your mind is screaming with alertness. I heard her stand there for a moment, probably watching me, making sure I was truly asleep. I heard the soft rustle of her jacket as she pulled her phone from her pocket. Then, the soft padding of her footsteps as she moved to the far side of the room, near the window, giving herself the illusion of privacy. A moment later, a hushed voice broke the silence. "We have a problem." It was Chloe. Her voice was stripped of all its artificial sweetness. It was tense, thin, and laced with frustration. "No, I am not being paranoid. I'm telling you, David, she's not some doddering old woman. She's observant." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I forced my breathing to remain steady. "The journal," she whispered angrily. She caught me with the journal. She knew exactly what page I was on. "Don't tell me to be more careful. I am doing everything you told me to do. The keys, the fake appointments, the thermostat, it's not working." She just looks at me with that calm little smile and says, "Thank you." It's like I don't know, it's like she's playing with me. There was a long pause. I could imagine my son on the other end, his voice a low murmur of pressure, of excuses. "What do you mean, up the ante?" Chloe hissed, her voice rising in disbelief. "What, you want me to start hiding her medication? Help her take a fall down the stairs? I am an actor, David, not a monster. This is already way beyond what we discussed." Another pause. This one was longer. The silence stretched, and I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. "Listen," Chloe finally said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "I don't give a damn about your creditors. That is your problem. You told me this was a simple, 2-week job. Convince the old lady she's losing her marbles so you can get power of attorney and manage her estate. You didn't say anything about her being smarter than both of us combined. You either wire the second half of my payment by Friday or I walk. And trust me, you don't want me to walk." The line went dead. I heard her take a shaky, angry breath. She stood by the window for another minute before I heard her footsteps walk out of the room and the sharp click of the kitchen door closing behind her. I lay there, wrapped in Robert's blanket, my eyes still shut tight. But I was no longer seeing the darkness of my own eyelids. I was seeing the truth in all its ugly, brutal clarity. The last fragile thread of hope I'd held for my son, that he was misguided, that he was being manipulated, snapped. He wasn't misguided. He was the director of this entire sickening play, and he was getting desperate. Up the ante. The words echoed in my mind. They had just confirmed my darkest suspicions. But they had also given me a gift. They had told me their next move, and they had just solidified my resolve into something as hard and as cold as diamond. I opened my eyes. The afternoon light slanted across the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The room was the same, but everything had changed. It was no longer my home. It was a theater of war, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, exactly what my next scene would be. Lying on the sofa and listening to my son plot against me had changed the very air in my house. It was no longer a place of quiet grief. It was a stage, and I was now its lead actor and director. They wanted to up the ante, did they? They wanted evidence of a confused, rambling old woman, lost in her memories and unable to manage her own affairs. Very well. I decided I would give them a command performance. A scene so perfectly tragic, so beautifully senile, that Chloe would have no choice but to write it all down, word for word. My prop was a silver-framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It was my favorite picture of Robert and me, taken on our 40th wedding anniversary. We were standing in our garden, the summer roses in full bloom behind us. He had his arm around me, and we were both laughing, his eyes crinkling at the corners in that way I adored. Using this image, this perfect moment of our shared joy, felt like a desecration. But I knew Robert, a man who loved history and strategy, would have understood. To catch a thief, sometimes you must bait the trap with something you hold dear. I waited 2 days, letting the tension build. I let Chloe see me looking at the photograph with a sad, distant expression. I was setting my stage. Then, on Tuesday evening, the moment felt right. A cold rain was lashing against the windows, and the wind howled around the eaves. Of the old house, we were in the living room. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the soft click of my knitting needles. Chloe was across from me, pretending to be absorbed in a glossy magazine, but I knew she was watching me. She was always watching me. I set my knitting aside with a sigh. I walked to the fireplace, my movements slow and deliberate, and picked up the silver frame. I ran my thumb over Robert's smiling face. I turned my back to Chloe, but angled myself so she could still see my reflection in the dark glass of the bay window. I took a deep, shaky breath, and the curtain went up. "Oh, Robert," I whispered, my voice thick with a carefully crafted sorrow. "It's all so difficult without you. Everything is confusing." I let my voice trail off, dabbing at my eyes with the sleeve of my sweater. In the reflection, I saw the magazine in Chloe's lap lower by an inch. Her focus was entirely on me. "David, he tries to help, but he doesn't understand," I continued, my voice gaining a note of frantic conspiracy. "He worries about the money. He doesn't know how well you provided for us, does he, my love? He doesn't know about our secret." I paused for dramatic effect. I could feel her leaning forward. "He doesn't know about the little safe you installed behind that loose brick in the fireplace, filled with all those old bearer bonds just in case things ever got difficult." I clutched the frame to my chest, turning to face the fireplace, as if sharing my secret only with the bricks and the flames. I lowered my voice to a conspiratorial whisper, just loud enough for her to hear. This was the most important part. I had to plant the flaw, the deliberate mistake that would, to any truly discerning mind, expose the entire performance as a fraud. "Don't you worry, my love," I breathed, tracing the outline of the frame. "I haven't forgotten. I remember the code we set. The shadows fall long at midnight. Our little secret, it's safe." The line was pure melodrama, stolen from an old black-and-white film noir Robert and I had laughed at years ago. It was so wonderfully, beautifully fake. I stood there for a long moment, then sighed, as if pulling myself back to reality. I placed the photograph carefully back on the mantel. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw what I was waiting for. Chloe's head was bent, her thumb moving rapidly across the screen of her phone, which she had half hidden in the folds of the magazine. Tap, tap, tap. The tiny, almost silent sound of her taking notes, of her documenting my grand performance. A cold, sharp thrill went through me. It wasn't triumph. It was the chilling feeling of an arrow hitting its mark. She had taken the bait. Every last, poisoned crumb of it. I turned from the fireplace and gave her a watery, vacant smile. "I think I'll go up to bed now, dear. I'm feeling very tired all of a sudden." She looked up, her face a perfect mask of gentle concern. "Of course, Maggie, you get some rest." As I walked out of the room, I thought to myself, the hook is set. Now we'll see if she's smart enough to spot the poison, or if she's just greedy enough to swallow it whole. After my performance by the fireplace, a new dynamic settled between us. Chloe was energized. She believed she had struck gold, that she now possessed a crucial piece of evidence of my mental decline. She began watching me with a new intensity, a hungry look in her eyes that she tried to disguise as attentiveness. She was waiting for the next breadcrumb, the next sign of weakness. I knew then that my next test couldn't be about something she could merely observe. It had to be a test of knowledge, of intimacy. It had to be a trap that only a true stranger would fall into. The opportunity came on a Friday afternoon. I had pulled out one of the old photo albums, a heavy book with a faded velvet cover. It was a believable activity for a lonely widow. I even invited Chloe to sit with me. "It's been so long since I've looked at these," I said, my voice soft. "It's nice to have some company." She sat beside me on the sofa, a little too close, her posture radiating eager concern. We paged through the years. There was David as a little boy with a gap-toothed smile, pictures from our trips to the coast, holidays with friends. With each photo, I would offer a small, true memory, lulling her into a false sense of genuine connection. Then I turned to a page that I had been looking for. It was a picture of Robert, taken in his study. He was sitting at his beloved mahogany chess table, looking down at the board with an expression of intense concentration, a slight smile playing on his lips. I smiled fondly, a real smile this time. "Oh, look, there he is, in his natural habitat," I said. "He could spend hours with that board. He said it wasn't a game, it was a conversation." I let my voice drift, my eyes going distant, as if I were getting lost in the memory. I was leading her down the garden path and she was following willingly. Then I let my face crumple just slightly, a look of frustration. I pressed my fingers to my temple. "It's so funny, the little things that slip away from you," I said, shaking my head. Robert had this little ritual. Whenever he finally solved one of his horrible chess puzzles, one that had been tormenting him for days, he'd lean back in his chair, look up at the ceiling, and say this one silly word. A little victory cry just for himself. I looked at Chloe then, my eyes wide and searching, a perfect picture of a woman struggling to grasp a fading memory. I was offering her a chance to be the hero, to supply the missing piece. It was a test of her ego, and I knew she wouldn't be able to resist. "Oh, what was it now?" I mumbled, looking back at the photo. "It was a chess word, I'm almost certain. Something to do with a rook." I let the question hang in the air between us. I could practically see the gears turning in her head. She saw her chance to shine, to prove how much she'd been listening, how well she understood the life of the woman she was trying to defraud. Her face lit up with a brilliant, false smile. "Oh, I think I know, Maggie," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "I bet I know what it was it? Checkmate." The word, so obvious, so perfectly, plausibly wrong, landed in the quiet room. It was the answer anyone would guess. It was the answer a stranger would give. For a moment, I felt an almost hysterical urge to laugh. It was so beautifully, predictably incorrect. But I held my composure. I looked at her, let my hopeful expression fade into one of gentle disappointment, and gave a small, sad shake of my head. "No," I said softly. "No, that's not it. How silly of me. It's gone completely." I closed the heavy album with a soft thud, a signal that the conversation and the test were over. "Thank you for trying to help, dear." I didn't tell her the real word. I didn't need to. The real word was Zugzwang, a German chess term Robert loved, meaning a situation where any move a player can make will worsen their position. He loved its fatalistic irony. It was obscure, personal. It was ours. Chloe's mistake wasn't just that she got the word wrong. Her fatal error was in trying to answer it all. A person who truly cared would have said, "It's okay that you can't remember, Maggie. It's the feeling that matters." They would have offered comfort, not a guess. But Chloe wasn't a comforter. She was a competitor. And in that moment, in her eagerness to score a point in a game she didn't understand, she had shown me her entire hand. She wasn't just a bad actor. She was a lazy one. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep and calm in my chest, that I was going to win. After the incident with the photo album, I felt the house holding its breath. Chloe was tiptoeing around me, her manufactured kindness now tinged with a nervous energy. She had failed her little test, and I think on some level she knew it. The power had shifted, and we both knew a final move was coming. It came 4 days later. The doorbell rang at precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I knew before I even opened the door that this was it. David stood on the porch, but he wasn't alone. Beside him was a woman in a severe gray pantsuit, her hair pulled back in a tight, unforgiving bun. She held a sleek leather briefcase and had a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Mom," David said, stepping inside and brushing rain from his coat. "This is Dr. Alastair. She's a geriatric care consultant. We asked her to come and have a chat." A geriatric care consultant. The title was so deliberately bland, so clinically condescending. She wasn't a lawyer, not officially, but she was a weapon all the same. I gave them a frail, questioning look and allowed them to guide me into the living room, to my armchair, the one I had carefully positioned in the center of my hidden camera's unwavering gaze. Chloe, who had been hovering in the kitchen, emerged on cue, her face a perfect portrait of worried devotion. She stood behind the consultant's chair like a nurse attending a surgeon. The stage was set. The players were in position. David cleared his throat and began the speech he had no doubt practiced in front of his bathroom mirror. "Mom, we're here because we're worried. I'm worried. We've all noticed you've been, well, having some trouble lately. Forgetting things, getting confused." I just stared at my hands, folded in my lap, playing my part. Dr. Alastair opened her briefcase with a sharp click. "Margaret," she began, her voice smooth and devoid of any real emotion. "It's common at a certain age, especially after a significant loss, to experience some cognitive disruption. Chloe has been keeping a log for us, just to get a clear picture of your day-to-day needs." She nodded to Chloe, who then produced a pristine, spiral-bound notebook. It was her journal of my supposed decline, the fiction we had co-authored. Dr. Alastair put on a pair of reading glasses and began to read from the notebook in a dry monotone. "On Tuesday, Margaret misplaced her car keys and they were later found in the sugar bowl. On Thursday, she seemed to have no memory of a scheduled doctor's appointment. On Friday." She continued on, listing all the little pieces of bait I had laid out. Each word was a small, satisfying confirmation of my own strategy. I felt a strange, icy calm settle over me. It was like watching a play where I had written not only my own lines, but the villains as well. Then, Dr. Alastair arrived at the climax of their evidence. "And just this past Tuesday evening," she said, her voice taking on a more serious tone, "Chloe documented a particularly concerning episode. Margaret was observed having a long, emotional conversation with a photograph of her late husband." She paused, letting the weight of the accusation sink in. "She was heard discussing financial matters, specifically some bearer bonds and a secret safe. She also recited what appears to be a password. The shadows fall long at midnight." Chloe looked down at the floor, a perfect imitation of pained embarrassment for my sake. David just stared at me, his expression a mixture of pity and resolve. They were all looking at me, the crazy old woman who talked to pictures. They had no idea that my silent partner, the little black book on the shelf, was recording every lie, every condescending glance, every moment of this meticulously planned ambush. Dr. Alastair closed the notebook with a soft, final snap. She leaned forward, her professional mask of sympathy firmly in place. "So, Margaret, as you can see, our concerns are not unfounded. We are here to help you manage things, to make sure you're safe and your affairs are in order. We only want what's best for you." She gave me a patient, pitying look. "Now, what do you have to say for yourself?" The three of them stared at me, waiting. They expected tears. They expected confusion. They expected a frightened, incoherent denial that would only serve to prove their point. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly in the tense silence. I didn't speak. Instead, I slowly reached for the glass of water on the small table beside me. I took a slow, deliberate sip, my hand perfectly steady. I set the glass down with a soft click, looked directly into Dr. Alastair's cold eyes, and held her gaze. The silence stretched, 1 second, 2, 3, and then I smiled. My smile felt alien on my own face. It was cold, sharp, and entirely without humor. I watched the three of them, my son, his hired actor, and their clinical executioner, as they stared at me, their collective expressions of pity waiting to curdle into annoyance at my lack of a proper, senile breakdown. The silence in the room was a living thing, heavy and taut. I had let them build their cage of lies around me, bar by flimsy bar. It was time to show them it was made of smoke. I set the water glass down and folded my hands in my lap. My voice, when I spoke, was not the thin, reedy thing I had been using for weeks. It was clear, steady, and resonant with an authority they had never heard from me before. "That was a very thorough presentation, Dr. Alastair," I began, my gaze sweeping over her before landing, with surgical precision, on Chloe. "You keep a very neat log, Chloe. Your attention to detail is commendable, but you made a few critical errors in your research." Chloe flinched, a barely perceptible tightening around her eyes. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Let's start with the small things," I said, my tone conversational. "My husband's love for chess, for instance. You were so keen to help me remember his little victory cry. You suggested checkmate." A sensible guess, very plausible. I paused, letting the word hang in the air. But incorrect. The word, dear, was Zugzwang. It's a German term. It describes a position in which a player is forced to make a move, and any move they make will only worsen their position. I let my eyes drift from Chloe to my son. A rather fitting word for your current predicament, wouldn't you agree? Dr. Alastair's thin smile flickered. David's face was a blank canvas of confusion. And then, I continued, my voice smooth as ice, there was my little performance by the fireplace, my tearful confession. It must have seemed like the answer to all your prayers. I turned to Dr. Alastair. Did you enjoy that line about the bearer bonds? And the code? The shadows fall long at midnight. I do hope you appreciated its dramatic flair. I stole it from a 1944 film noir called Danger in the Dark. Robert and I watched it years ago. We thought it was hysterically overwrought. I leaned forward slightly, my gaze locking onto the so-called consultant. And as the wife of a history professor, I would have thought you'd have done your research. The United States Treasury stopped issuing bearer bonds in 1982. A rather glaring factual. Error in my delusion, wouldn't you say? Dr. Alastair's mouth opened, then closed again. The professional mask was beginning to crack, revealing the confused woman underneath. Finally, I turned to my son. All the coldness in my voice melted away, replaced by a sorrow so profound it felt like a physical weight in my chest. "Oh, David," I said softly. "All of this elaborate, cruel, and frankly poorly written play, all this effort to prove I've lost my mind." I shook my head slowly. "All because you were too much of a coward to simply ask me for money again." "Mom, we were just worried." He began to stammer, his eyes darting towards Dr. Alastair for help. I held up a single hand, and he fell silent. "And speaking of performances," I said, my voice dropping, pulling the focus of the entire room, "I must confess, you weren't the only ones doing the recording." Slowly, deliberately, I rose from my chair. I walked to the bookshelf, my steps even and sure. I reached out and took the copy of Tales of Mystery and Imagination from the shelf. I walked back to the coffee table and placed the book down in front of them with a soft, definitive thud. I turned it around so the spine was facing them, so they could all see the small, dark, unblinking lens nestled amongst the gold lettering. "You wanted to up the ante," I said, looking directly at my son. "You wanted to document everything, so I did." My gaze flickered to Chloe, who looked as though she was about to be physically ill. "I have the recording of your phone call, Chloe, the one with David, the one where you complained I was sharper than I look, the one where he talked about his creditors and you threatened to walk unless he wired you more money." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. Dr. Alastair's face was utterly slack, her professional composure shattered into a million pieces. Chloe was ashen, her hands trembling in her lap. And David, my son, he just stared at the camera lens, his face pale and blotchy, his mouth hanging slightly open, looking as if the floor had just dissolved into nothingness beneath his feet. Checkmate. The silence in the living room was so complete, I could hear the rain tapping against the windowpane again. It was a sound I had always found soothing, but now it sounded like applause from a somber audience. Dr. Alastair was the first to recover, her professionalism kicking in as a form of damage control. Her face, which had been slack with shock, hardened back into a mask of grim efficiency. She snapped her briefcase shut, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. She stood, smoothed down her pantsuit, and without a single glance at me or my son, turned and walked out of my house. She didn't even bill me for her time. Chloe was next. She looked up at me, her face pale and tear-streaked. All the fight, all the performance was gone. She just looked like a young, stupidly ambitious girl who had made a catastrophic mistake. She opened her mouth to say something, an apology, an excuse I'll never know, but I just gave a slight shake of my head. There was nothing to say. She seemed to understand. She stood up on trembling legs and practically fled, leaving the front door ajar in her wake. And then it was just the two of us, mother and son. The silence between us was heavier than all the words that had been spoken. David wouldn't look at me. He just stared at the little black book on the table, this tiny object that had undone him so completely. "Mom," he whispered, his voice hoarse. I can explain. I didn't mean." "Don't, David," I said, and my voice was gentle, which somehow made it more final. "Don't lie anymore, not now." He finally looked at me then, his eyes pleading. They were the same eyes I had looked into when he was a boy, crying over a scraped knee. The instinct to comfort him, to make it all better, was a ghost that flickered inside me, a painful echo of a love that no longer had a place to live. "I'm not going to press charges," I told him, and I saw a flicker of relief cross his face before I extinguished it. "Your punishment won't be a courtroom. It will be this moment, knowing that you tried to destroy me for money, and you failed." I stood up and walked to the front door, holding it open. "Get your things out of the guest room, and then you need to leave my house." He looked utterly broken. "Mom, please." "No," I said, and the word was as solid and immovable as a mountain. "The game is over, David." He finally stood, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and walked past me without another word. I watched him go. And as I closed the door on my only son, I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel victory. I just felt the profound, aching grief of a necessary amputation. The silence in the house after he left was different. It wasn't the lonely, heavy silence of grief. It was clean. It was the silence of a blank page. 6 months later, that page was filled with a new story. I sold the big house, with all its ghosts and its space I no longer needed. I moved into a bright, airy apartment downtown, with a balcony that overlooked the town square. Eleanor was sitting across from me at my new kitchen table, a ray of autumn sunshine warming her face. Between us was a stack of freshly printed brochures. "The Robert Vance Memorial Fund," she read aloud, a proud smile on her face. "A grant providing pro bono legal services and financial literacy workshops for seniors." She looked at me over the top of her glasses. "He would have loved this, Maggie. Using his mind to protect others. It's perfect." I picked up a brochure. On the front was the same smiling photo from the mantelpiece, the one I had used as a prop. But now it felt different. It was no longer a painful memory. It was a symbol of purpose. We hadn't just won a battle. We had built a fortress for others. My inheritance, which David had seen as a prize to be stolen, had become a shield. My pain had been forged into a tool to ensure others might not have to feel the same. Eleanor reached across the table and patted my hand. "So, are you happy, my friend?" I looked out the window at the clear, blue sky. I thought of the chessboard, the pieces all now packed away in a box in storage. The king, the queen, the pawns, the lies, the traps, the final, quiet checkmate. I had been forced into a game I never wanted to play, but I had played it, and I had won. Not when I revealed the camera, but now, in this moment. The victory wasn't in his defeat. It was in my peace. "Yes, Eleanor," I said, and the word felt true and solid in my chest. "I am." The game was over, and for the first time in a very long time, the board was clear. My husband Robert used to say that every chess game teaches you a lesson, not just about your opponent, but about yourself. The game I was forced to play taught me a painful one, that sometimes the people closest to you can see you not as a person, but as a problem to be solved or a prize to be won. But it taught me a more powerful lesson, too. It taught me that intellect and worth are not things that fade with age. It reminded me that dignity is not defended with loud arguments or angry tears, but with quiet intelligence and a resolve as hard as steel. The world can be a noisy place, and it's easy to think that the loudest voice is the strongest. My story is a reminder that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one no one is listening to, until it's too late. If my journey has touched something in you, if you have ever felt underestimated, unheard, or had your strength mistaken for frailty, I would be honored to hear from you in the comments below. Your voice matters, and your story of resilience could be the beacon of hope that someone else desperately needs to see. This community is a place for our stories to be shared and our strength to be recognized. If you believe these stories of survival and quiet justice deserve to be heard, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know. Finally, if any part of my story felt uncomfortably familiar, for yourself or for someone you love, please know there are dedicated people who can help. Organizations like the National Council on Aging have resources and confidential support available. You are not alone in this fight. Thank you for listening. And remember, never let anyone mistake your silence for weakness. Often, it is simply the quiet before you make your winning move.